like to thank Andy and thank the sponsoring organizations for inviting me here to give a talk. Now, when I initially agreed to do this talk, the world was very different. And so I would be derelict in my duty to not actually take up current events. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Hopefully it'll make sense. I offer these talks in the spirit of provocation. And so, you know, I encourage people in the Q&A, you know, to ask questions, to say what you think, to disagree, and to really participate in the spirit of collectively trying to figure out how do we move forward in this increasingly frightening society. And so with that, let's get started. Just over 8 years ago, when Barack Obama became president of the United States, the national conversation in the country was whether or not the U.S. was going to become a post-racial society. Indeed, in December of 2008, Forbes magazine ran an exuberant editorial that claimed, quote, "Racism in America is over." But slightly more than 8 long years later, we could not be further from that conversation. Not only is racism not over in the United States, but an unabashed racist sits at its helm. Donald Trump ran a campaign fueled on racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, sexism, and rabid nationalism. It is not hyperbole to say that white supremacy sits at the heart of the American government. Donald Trump chose as his chief strategist Steve Bannon, the former editor of the race-baiting, hate-mongering Breitbart News.
That's right.
Bannon once bragged that Breitbart was a platform for the so-called alt-right, which is nothing other than a new name for white supremacists.
That's right.
There is also Stephen Miller, who was the architect of the Muslim travel ban, and who at one point was a protege of express white supremacist Richard Spencer when both were at Duke University.
Awesome.
More important then, the campaign promises of a bigot and a sexual predator have been brought to life in Trump's rise to the presidency. And despite the so-called populist rhetoric of Trump during the campaign, his cabinet choices, an array of billionaires, campaign donors, and wholly unqualified individuals, betray an agenda intended to gut the living standards of ordinary and working-class people across this country while continuing to line the pockets of the rich. Whatever fragile remnants of government and social welfare intended to protect the public from the ravages of the free market status quo will be shredded. Trump has put a fox in every henhouse with regards to the individuals he has chosen to oversee posts in the Environmental Protection Agency, in the Department of Labor, in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, in the Department of Education. All are populated by individuals who have either profited from the unequal distribution of wealth in this society or from the frequent crises unleashed by the imbalance of power in this society. Individuals who question the very necessity of the agencies that they have been tasked with overseeing, creating a recipe for either inaction or ineptitude. The righteous fear of Trump and the budding resistance to his dangerous administration should not, however, obscure the very important discussion of how we got here and how this happened in the first place. Many media narratives have tried to make sense of the apparent contradiction of high approval ratings for former President Barack Obama and the electoral victory of Donald Trump. As incongruent as it may seem, in fact, the two are connected. As wholly opposite in demeanor, aptitude, and temperament as Barack Obama and Donald Trump are, we cannot actually understand the rise of Trump without taking account of the failure of Obama to deliver on his promises of hope and change. Embedded inside of every right-wing backlash is the failure of the liberal establishment to provide a better way. The media narrative locating Trump's rise solely in his ability to connect with the dispossessed so-called white working class is incomplete at best and disingenuous and exaggerated at worst. Most Trump supporters had a median income of $72,000 a year compared to the $55,000 median income for most white people. Of voters making $50,000 or less, most of them voted for Clinton. Trump's rise is actually a story about who did not vote more than who did vote. In fact, Trump won with fewer voters than Republican candidate Mitt Romney in 2012. So to begin with, tens of millions of Americans did not bother to vote at all. There are 238 million eligible voters in the United States, and of that number, only 60 million of them voted for Trump. And even among them, 5% said that he was unfit to be president. The real story of the 2016 presidential election is that literally tens of millions of voters decided not to vote at all. The media and other political operatives describe this decision not to vote as apathy. It is an easy description that requires little thought or analysis of the problem within electoral politics that creates so little confidence and so much indifference, even when it appears that so much is at stake. And one need look no further than the Democratic Party to fully understand the scope of the problem. Since the shock of the election, the Democrats have blamed their losses on Fox News, on bad messaging, on the FBI, on emails, and of course on the Russians. But there is virtually no reckoning with the political shortcomings of the party. There is no reckoning with how this party that purports to be a party of the people consistently fails to deliver actual change for the ordinary people it claims to represent. For example, the presidency of Barack Obama is deemed a success simply because of the absence of any real scandal that marred his presidency. The so-called success of the Obama administration is a lesson in how the performance and appearance of civility often passes as political accomplishment or legitimacy in this country. But while Obama could be complimented for his good manners and wholesome disposition, and even while taking into account the historic significance of his presidency as an African American in a country founded on slavery, and where Jim Crow was the law of the land until 2 generations ago, those facts should not blind us to other facts. Chief among the other facts were Obama's inability to challenge the political and economic status quo for millions of people in this country. For the political and economic elite, including the leadership of the Democratic Party, the absence of scandal or catastrophe registers as success. Because this was not like the administration of George W. Bush, which took the country into an illegal and immoral war with the country of Iraq in 2003. This was not Bush crashing the American economy and threatening to take the global economy with it in 2007 and 2008. This was not the Bush administration's collective shrug in the face of the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. However, for millions of people in this country, it is the status quo that is increasingly intolerable. It gnaws away at the tiny threads millions of people are hanging on to as they struggle to make the ends meet every day. For people who pine for the good old days of Obama, or who wistfully long for what could have been with Hillary Clinton as president, it is only because the lives of ordinary people who struggle with the unspectacular and unglamorous crisis of everyday life have been rendered invisible. We live in a celebrity culture that glorifies the rich and the famous while ignoring the quotidian and mundane. Imagine if we had a press, a popular culture, or a political class that was curious about the lives of poor people or working class people. If we did, what would they find? What is the status quo over the last several years? They would find a continuing crisis of opioid addiction in this country. There are 2 million people addicted to opioids in the United States, a disproportionate number of whom are white. Half of those people are addicted to heroin. From 2009 to 2014, almost 500,000 people have died from opioid overdoses, a 4-fold increase since 1999. They would find in the status quo a briefly reported on story in the news about the reported decline in life expectancy for white women. It is unprecedented for life expectancy to reverse in a so-called first world country. In the U.S.'s peer countries, life expectancy is growing. Why is life expectancy for white working class women in decline? Drug overdose, suicide, and alcohol abuse. Indeed, a recent study has projected that the United States as a whole will have a life expectancy rate on par with Mexico and Croatia by the year 2030. Already, the United States lags behind all of its peer countries in life expectancy for the entire population. What else is in the status quo over the last several years? The quiet deportation and removal of 2.5 million undocumented people during the tenure of Barack Obama. In 2012 alone, more than 400,000 undocumented individuals, women, children, men, families, were detained, held in private detention centers with few rights recognized by their captors until they were forcibly returned to the countries they had fled. Now, we can all look in horror at the indiscriminate way that the Trump administration has empowered immigration control enforcement agents to swoop into immigrant communities and round people up. But we must acknowledge that Obama's administration greased the wheels to this machinery of injustice a long time ago. In the status quo, we would find in Chicago that there has been the rise in shootings and murders in the city's working-class black neighborhoods. In 2016, there were 4,379 people shot and 797 people killed in Chicago. The overwhelming majority of both were African American. The news media's nonsensical explanations for this violence include things like retaliation. But that is only matched by the nonsense offered by elected officials, which includes things like the absence of role models or poor parenting. What is almost never offered as an explanation, or at least part of an answer, is how Chicago has the highest black unemployment rate of the nation's 5 largest cities, at 25%. That nearly half of black men aged 20 to 24 in Chicago are neither in school nor employed. That Chicago has the 3rd highest poverty rate of large cities in America, and that it is the most segregated city in the United States. Instead of dealing with the social catastrophe of poverty, unemployed, a destroyed social safety net, and public infrastructure, combined with the proliferation of easily obtained guns, the Trump administration and the right wing has used the reality of violence to silence the focus on police abuse and instead shift the conversation to what they refer to as black-on-black crime. This is racist nonsense intended to muffle the conversation about racist and abusive police in this country, right at the time that Trump is looking to consolidate and expand the powers of the police. Part of the justification for this expansion of police powers is to paint black working-class communities as out-of-control jungles, or the inner cities that Donald Trump keeps referring to, that must be tamed. There is no discussion about expanding any number of social programs that could actually attend to the issues of poverty and the problems that arise from it. Instead, it is law and order. If the Black Lives Matter movement has done nothing else, it has exposed to the world what Black America has always known, which is that the police are racist agents of the state who profile, target, harass, abuse, while acting in wholly unjust ways. These abusive approaches to policing have intensified over the last several years because they are a built-in response to a political system that offers little by way of social welfare to respond to social crises. These contradictions, of course, created the conditions for the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. Finally, there is the status quo of the shrinking middle class. In the 1970s, 61% of Americans fell into that vague but stable category of middle class. Today, that number has fallen to 50%. It is driven by the growing wealth inequality that exists in this country. In the last year alone, the 1%, the richest people in this country, saw their income rise by 7%. And the 0.1%, the really richest people in this country, saw their income rise by 9%. In general, the richest 20% of households in the United States own 84% of the wealth in this country, while the bottom 40% own less than 1%. The media would have us believe that this is a story primarily about the Rust Belt and disgruntled white workers. In fact, it is also a story about the 240,000 Black homeowners who lost their houses to foreclosures in the last 8 years. It is also about urban school closures and the decimation of employment for Black educators. Thousands of Black teachers have been fired in the last decade. The Occupy Wall Street movement that erupted in the fall of 2011 gave us the popular language to understand this phenomenon, the 1% versus the 99%. There are 400 billionaires in this country. They are the reason why there are 45 million poor people here. You cannot have untold obscene wealth unless you have untold obscene poverty. But economic inequality and racial injustice don't operate on parallel tracks. They reinforce one another. In fact, racism and discrimination are projected loudly from the top to provide an explanation for economic inequality. We are told that undocumented Mexican immigrants are to blame for unemployment. We are told that Black criminals are to blame for poverty. We are told that Muslim terrorists are to blame for shifting billions of dollars from domestic spending to foreign policy. In effect, we are told that the least powerful and least influential among us are the problem, while the millionaires and billionaires who actually run this country are innocent bystanders. That is how racial and economic inequality complement each other and in the end result in more hardship for regular people. 8 years later, when we put these conditions of the status quo that I described together, they tell a complete story of deprivation and desperation that exists all over this country. They tell the story of the millions of people who have been left behind. This is the status quo. This is life in the United States without some spectacular catastrophe. This is the so-called lesser evil. And it's the inability of the political system and the political establishment to change this dynamic and thus deliver actual changes for the better in people's lives that lead them to ignore elections. When people believed that electing Obama would transform this country and their lives, they voted in historic numbers. But with big expectations and big hope invested in Obama came even bigger disappointment when he failed to deliver. It is absolutely true that the Republicans had been obstinate, recalcitrant, and opposed to giving Obama an inch when he was in office. It speaks to the complete dysfunction of our political system. But it is not just the obstinacy of the Republicans that has been the problem. It was also the narrow and limited vision of Obama's political agenda. Hillary Clinton also ignored everyday conditions experienced by regular people. She ran a campaign where her main slogan was, "America's already great." She ran a campaign focused on the abhorrent behavior of Donald Trump instead of articulating how the party could actually transform those conditions. Clinton promised to be a third term of Obama, failing to realize that for millions of voters, 2 terms was enough. In some ways, it's easy to understand why Clinton stuck to this message. The Democratic Party is committed to the economic status quo represented by free market capitalism. They are its champions. They have championed the political ethos of what some refer to as neoliberalism, or the idea that the market is the best way to deliver public services, and that competition is what drives efficiency in government. But if the market is predicated on the idea that there are winners and losers, then this, of course, is a terrible way to run a government. It is a terrible way to deliver education, water, housing, food, healthcare, justice, and other vital necessities that any civilization is dependent upon. But most importantly, if this is the root of your political commitment to the market, to neoliberalism, as it is, I would argue, for the Democratic Party, then that in and of itself necessarily limits the range of political change that you can advance in that party. It was impossible for Clinton to argue that her party would deliver change and break the grip of political order that privileges the rich and powerful, when the Democrats have been in power for the last 8 years, supporting policies that have maintained the division between the 1% and the 99%. In other words, we cannot understand the rise of Trump and Trumpism by only looking at what he and the Republicans have done. We must also understand it in terms of what the Democratic Party has not done. Bernie Sanders recognized this. He ran a campaign in the primaries that tapped into the realization that for most ordinary people, things are getting worse. He recognized that it is the responsibility of government to alleviate those pressures through provision. And with no money and almost no name recognition, and with the entire Democratic Party establishment trained against him, he nearly won the party's nomination for president. If you want to understand the depth of suffering in this country, know that 13 million people cast their vote for an open socialist. You have to have some sense of history to understand how unprecedented that was. In the 1950s, this was the country of the Red Scare. This was the country of anti-communism. This is a country that executed 2 communists for being communists, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, in 1953. The insurgent campaign of Sanders can be read as an indictment of an economic system that has failed over and over and over again to deliver a better way for most people in this country. But when Sanders insists on hitching his wagon to that Democratic Party train, then he undercuts much of the critique he makes because it's a party that embodies the injustice and inequality he rails so passionately against. And why is this history important? Because in 2018, there will be a midterm election. And the Democratic Party is hoping that the presence of Trump alone will be enough to discipline its base into shutting up and turning out to vote while demanding nothing in return. The Democratic Party, of course, believes that it is entitled to to our vote while having to do absolutely nothing to earn it. History can be a powerful tool in reminding us how we got to this point, especially when the Democratic Party offers us nothing other than not being Trump as the only compelling reason to vote for him. None of this is to imply or say that it is inconsequential that Trump is now president. He is dangerous. But he is also hobbled by reality. Even though he was adept at identifying and exploiting the fears and anxiety of millions of white Americans and handfuls of other people who voted for him, he cannot deliver on his promise to make America great again. It's a promise based on a foundation of lies of what actually the problem is in the United States. Trump and his white supremacist advisors say that the U.S. is suffering from an influx of immigrants, radical Islamic terrorism, crime and violence, free trade. Much of this is racist dribble intended to stoke fear and promote scapegoating to blame the most vulnerable among us. When it comes to finding a scapegoat and stoking racism, Donald Trump is, of course, firmly operating in a long tradition of the American political establishment. It is true that free trade agreements often result in job losses for working people. But the real problem is an economic system that literally profits from driving down the wages and living standards of working people across the world. They pit workers of different nationalities against each other to convince them that the suffering of one group of workers is to the benefit of another group of workers, when in reality the suffering of all workers is to the benefit of the rich and powerful who own the companies and corporations we are forced to work for in order to make a living in the first place. And so it can almost be guaranteed that when Trump is unable to deliver on his promises to make America great again, he and his administration will double down on racism and disorder. They will use that as a pretext to justify racism and repression. We can already see this taking shape. The executive orders dealing with immigration and law enforcement are designed to stoke fear while rapidly expanding the powers of all police and law enforcement agents. Trump wants to give local police the power of immigration control agents. He wants to increase the authority of the police. It's not necessarily intended to deport the 11 million people living in this country without papers, but it is intended to stoke fear and suspicion. It is intended to turn neighbor against neighbor, classmate against classmate, worker against worker. The expansion of policing powers of the state are also intended to lay the foundation for the repression of a growing resistance movement. The Trump administration is well aware of the opposition and resistance his administration has provoked. Just read his tweets. They have been met with unprecedented protests. The day after he was inaugurated, estimates of between 3 and 4 million people participated in protests directed at his administration in this country and around the world. Muslim travel ban, tens of thousands of spontaneous protests erupted at the nation's airports. There is organizing happening in every corner of the United States. Some of it is brand new, some of it is building on campaigns that have been underway for years now. Despite whatever lies they tell, they know their political agenda will continue to inspire protest, and so they want to create the conditions to help repress the social movements that are developing. And that means that we need larger and more effective protests. Some have asked whether or not protests or demonstrations actually matter. What can protests do? Black Lives Matter is only one example to look at when understanding the importance of protests. Police brutality was not a new issue in 2014. It was a very old issue in black life in this country. But when the rebellion in Ferguson happened, when Mike Brown was killed in August of 2014, drew national attention to the phenomenon of police murder and judicial misconduct. It also provided a model for communities to know how to respond to police violence through protest, activism, organizing. Protest can force open new and challenging discussions on a much broader basis while not allowing a particular issue to be swept under the rug. Black Lives Matter changed the conversation about police brutality in the United States. It provided language for people to articulate their frustration with police violence and abuse. It provided an analysis for why this violence was happening. But the Black Lives Matter movement also shows the limitations of social movements that do not advance beyond just highlighting injustice. Knowledge alone of abuse, injustice, and oppression will not actually change those conditions. Instead, mass movements of the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions have to be mobilized to stare down the autocratic impulses of the regime in the White House. We can only imagine a movement on that scale when individuals move beyond the particular issues that directly affect them, but also see the relationship or connection between all oppressions. It means organizing across movements. In other words, police brutality is not just affecting African Americans, even when it has a disproportionate effect in black communities, but it also impacts Latino communities, immigrant communities more broadly, and certainly Arab and Muslim communities. It also means looking at how police repression has historically gone beyond their usual maintenance of racial boundaries in the United States to attacking working-class white people when they begin to organize and mobilize against the status quo. People should remember in the winter and spring of 2012, before Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, local police coordinated across the country with the FBI to physically repress the nonviolent encampments of the Occupy movement in parks and public spaces across this country. It is in everyone's interest to protest the racism and authoritarianism of the police. This is the urgency in building on the basis of solidarity and mutual understanding. And while it can appear as if we are a long way from that kind of struggle, when individuals are demonstrating and confronting the political status quo, they are suddenly open to new ideas and approaches that they may not have considered at an earlier time when organizing was more difficult or when an individual did not consider themselves to be political. In moments like the one we are living through now, political consciousness can develop very quickly, and people's ideas and expectations can change rapidly. For example, no one expected 3 to 4 million, mostly women, but men also, to fill the streets the day after the inauguration of Trump. Not a single person on those demonstrations across the country believed that that would be the only demonstration that they were going to be a part of in the next 4 years. Millions of people understand the threat presented by the Trump administration, and that knowledge can be turned into action and into organization. And again, it cannot be sidetracked into settling only for the election of Democrats in 2018 and 2020. We have to stop constraining our own political imagination into what is deemed pragmatic and possible. No social movement has ever begun with the question of what is realistic. Black people in the South called what we now refer to as the Civil Rights Movement the Freedom Movement. When the movement did not go far enough, black organizers in the South and North engaged engaged in what they called the Black Liberation Movement. Even though these struggles included all kinds of people who had different ideas of how to achieve those goals, the point was that we have to say what it is that we want. This is especially true today, when there are those who will insist that we quiet down and be reasonable. But as the great historian Howard Zinn told us, you cannot be neutral on a moving train. We have to fight the battles in the here and now, but we also have to fight for what we want. And that is a different kind of world altogether. Another world is possible, one free of racism, nationalism and borders, religious bigotry, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, but it is a world that has to be organized and fought for. Thank you. Problematic. I mean, you don't want to encourage the CIA, the FBI, or any of these organizations that are historically hostile to progressives, to communities of color, to immigrant populations. You don't want to encourage things that actually make them stronger and put them in a more emboldened position. And so, you know, it is problematic that and indicative that the Democratic Party you've seen more energy out of them in trying to arrange hearings about the role of Russia in the elections in the Trump administration than any other area of what is happening right now in this country. So just a thing about privilege. Let me just say that I think the language, I mean, this is my own personal preference and thoughts, but the language of allyship, I don't get it. I don't necessarily understand it. I think that if you're engaged in political struggle against oppression and exploitation, I think that the politics of solidarity mean that you actually have a stake in whether or not these struggles fail or succeed. And the whole thing about being an ally makes it seem as if whether or not you get involved in struggle is an expression of altruism, that you're doing it as almost charity, and it doesn't capture. And I understand why people say it, and so I'm not hostile to people who express that. It's usually trying to figure out how you fit into the movement, whether or not you fit into the movement. But I think that ordinary white people, middle-class white people who are politically conscious and active, have an active interest in fighting racism. And so it's not like, well, I can either not fight racism or fight racism because it has no impact on me. The best example I like to give for this is last year was the 20th anniversary of Bill Clinton's ending of welfare. Bill Clinton ran, President Bill Clinton ran on a pledge to end welfare as we know it. And in 1996, he signed a bill called the Personal Responsibility at Work Act. And there was a big to-do about it. He had a big signing ceremony in the Rose Garden of the White House. And at that ceremony, he was surrounded by black women who had been on welfare. Now, what Bill Clinton knew, and what probably no one else knew, was that the majority of people on welfare at that time were white women. But he didn't surround himself with white women at that signing ceremony. He surrounded himself with black women to reinforce the stereotype that welfare was an entitlement for lazy black women who didn't want to get out and work. And so he used racism to push through that legislation, but guess who it also affected? White women. That's right. And their families, who were also trying to get by on welfare. And so, to me, that's a tangible example of how racism can be black people's burden, but it is also white people's problem. And when the United States government spends $80 billion a year to keep its prisons and its criminal justice system intact, they use racism to justify that. The black criminals, the inner cities, all the chaos going on in Chicago. They use racism to justify that. But that impacts everyone who relies on public services to have that money shifted from schools, from hospitals, from libraries, into the criminal justice system. So racism is our problem. And that means that it's not a question of ally or not ally, it's a question of comrades, of people united in a common struggle. And what I'll say about privilege, you know, I just think that it's a word that doesn't capture much. And in some ways, it reflects the really low and narrow expectations we've come to have in this country. So in my talk, I said that the median income of, you know, a typical white family is $55,000 a year. Now think about that. This is the richest country on earth. 400 billionaires. You have TV shows that glorify 5,000 square foot mansions. And $55,000 is the median income. And you only think that's a lot of money if you've never tried to live on it, let alone try to raise a family on it. Now, it is also the case that the median income for black families is $35,000. Now, there's a $20,000 differential. But if you call that a privilege, having $50,000 over $35,000, in my opinion, you're missing the point.
That's right.
The privilege are the billionaires, are the millionaires, are the people who are actually living well because we're quibbling over $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. And it doesn't mean that that is insignificant or that those differences are real, but to talk about them as a privilege is to really miss, to me, it's to miss the point of what is actually happening in this country. And so I think what I'm talking about is about expecting more, it is about demanding more, and is to stop quibbling between ourselves over the crumbs that they kick off the table like garbage that they have no interest in, and we're scurrying around fighting each other for it. And it doesn't mean that we don't recognize that that there are differences and that black life in this country is incredibly hard, that Latino life in this country has been hard and is about to get extremely harder, that life for Arabs and Muslims in this country is about to get as hard as anything that any of us can imagine. But if we keep trying to compete with each other about who has it worse, we don't take the time to figure out how do we unite on what connects us to build the largest and most effective movement to attack the people who are at the root of all of our oppression. That, to me, should be the objective. And so that's what I'll leave you with, is that we have a big challenge, and that's to figure out how to build the largest and most effective movement possible, because the things that they are talking about will absolutely destroy people's families. And so there is an urgency to figuring this out. And I encourage people to take part in that process, because it will determine what our future is. Thank you.